The day people laugh at preparation is usually the day they stop paying attention to reality. The sharp whine of a concrete saw cut through the warm afternoon air as a fine cloud of gray dust drifted across my backyard, settling over my work boots while the smell of wet cement mixed with freshly cut grass and blooming magnolias. I pressed my palm against the final section of reinforced concrete, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips before checking the laser level one last time. The wall stood just under 4 feet tall, straight as a survey line, quietly waiting for a job I hoped it would never have to perform. Across the street came the sound of applause followed by laughter. I looked up to find Linda Whitmore standing with several homeowners near the sidewalk, her sunglasses resting on top of perfectly styled hair while she pointed her phone directly toward me. "Everyone needs to see this," she announced with a grin that carried farther than her voice. Our neighborhood engineer finally finished building his own private fortress. A few people chuckled. Someone joked that I must know something about the end of the world. Another neighbor asked whether I expected Noah to dock an ark in my backyard. Even a delivery driver slowed his truck long enough to glance toward the growing crowd before continuing down the street. I simply returned my attention to the wall. "My name is Ethan Carter. I am 43 years old, and I have spent more than 2 decades designing stormwater systems, evaluating floodplains, and studying how water behaves when people forget that geography always has the final vote. My profession has taken me across rivers, levees, neighborhoods, and construction sites throughout the Midwest. I have stood inside emergency operations centers while maps filled with expanding shades of blue. I have watched homeowners stare at soaked family photographs, wondering how a place that had never flooded suddenly disappeared beneath muddy water. The answer was almost never sudden. Water always leaves clues long before it arrives. Most people simply do not know how to read them. That was why I bought this particular property 3 years earlier. While buyers admired hardwood floors and oversized kitchens, I spent hours reviewing elevation surveys, historic drainage maps, and county engineering records. Beneath the carefully landscaped lawns of Brookhaven Ridge lay the forgotten path of an old drainage corridor redirected decades before the subdivision existed. The underground pipes installed by developers met the minimum standards required at the time, but every engineering model has assumptions, and assumptions eventually meet storms larger than expected. My flood wall was never designed to challenge nature. It was designed to respect it. Every permit had been approved. Every inspection had passed. Every calculation had been reviewed. Yet none of those facts seemed to matter as Linda slowly walked closer with the confidence of someone who believed appearances outweighed physics. She folded her arms and smiled politely. "You know that wall violates the character of this community," she said. "People move here because everything looks open and welcoming." I met her eyes without raising my voice. "People also move here believing their homes are safe." For just a moment the smile faded before returning even wider than before. She laughed softly, turned back toward her audience, and shook her head as though I had confirmed every rumor she wanted people to believe. I watched her walk away while a light breeze carried the faint scent of approaching rain from somewhere far beyond the western horizon. The forecast still called for scattered summer showers, but the clouds gathering in the distance told a very different story, and experience had taught me something that no neighborhood meeting ever could. Nature never asks for permission before reminding people where the water has always wanted to go. My father used to tell me that every flood begins long before the first raindrop falls. As a kid, I thought he was talking about clouds. Years later, I realized he was talking about people. I was 12 years old when the Cedar River climbed over its banks and turned our quiet neighborhood outside Davenport, Iowa, into a muddy lake. I still remember standing on the roof of our garage wrapped in a raincoat that had stopped keeping me dry hours earlier. The air smelled of wet lumber, gasoline, and river mud while tree branches floated past like they belonged somewhere else. My father never panicked. Instead, he pointed toward the rushing water below and quietly said something that shaped the rest of my life. "The river is only following the path everyone forgot." Those words stayed with me through every year that followed. While most of my classmates dreamed about becoming doctors, athletes, or pilots, I spent weekends studying topographic maps borrowed from the local library. I became fascinated by contour lines, drainage basins, culverts, retention ponds, and the invisible systems hidden beneath ordinary neighborhoods. Water was never random. It obeyed gravity with absolute honesty. If people interrupted its natural course without understanding the consequences, the water eventually corrected the mistake. That curiosity became a career. After earning my degree in civil engineering, I specialized in stormwater management and flood mitigation. My work carried me across the Midwest, inspecting aging levees, reviewing subdivision drainage plans, and helping communities reduce flood risks before disasters happened. I learned to recognize warning signs that most homeowners never noticed. A slight depression in a backyard, an undersized storm drain, a neighborhood built over a former creek bed. Small details that looked harmless during sunny afternoons often became expensive lessons during heavy storms. When I first visited Brookhaven Ridge, the real estate agent proudly showed me upgraded kitchens, oversized garages, and beautifully landscaped entrances. I thanked her politely, but I spent more time studying the slope of the streets than the granite countertops. Before making an offer, I requested county survey records, historical aerial photographs, and archived drainage plans dating back several decades. Buried beneath the polished appearance of the subdivision, I found exactly what I suspected. Long before the houses existed, a natural drainage corridor crossed the property, carrying runoff toward a larger creek several miles away. Developers had redirected that flow into underground concrete pipes designed according to standards that were considered acceptable at the time. The calculations were legal. They were approved. They also left very little room for unusually intense rainfall. Most buyers would never have noticed. An engineer could not ignore it. That was why I purchased one of the lowest lots in the neighborhood without hesitation. Friends questioned my decision. The real estate agent suggested I reconsider. I simply smiled because I was buying the land with full knowledge of its history rather than its appearance. Over the next several months, I hired licensed surveyors, consulted soil specialists, completed hydraulic calculations, and worked closely with county officials before submitting plans for a reinforced flood protection wall. Every drawing was reviewed. Every permit was approved. Every inspection passed exactly as required. I never expected my greatest challenge would come from the weather. Instead, it arrived wearing expensive clothes, carrying a clipboard, and believing that attractive landscaping mattered more than understanding how water always finds the truth. The first certified letter arrived exactly 3 days after the wall was completed. I found it resting inside my mailbox beneath grocery advertisements and utility bills, its heavy envelope carrying the polished Brookhaven Ridge Homeowners Association seal, as though it represented something far more powerful than a neighborhood committee. I opened it while standing in my driveway, the warm morning sun reflecting off perfectly trimmed lawns as automatic sprinklers clicked from yard to yard in synchronized rhythm. The language inside was carefully written, polite on the surface and threatening underneath. My flood wall was described as an unauthorized visual obstruction that disrupted community harmony, diminished neighborhood aesthetics, and violated architectural standards. I was ordered to remove it within 30 days or face weekly fines that would continue increasing until the structure disappeared. I smiled slightly, folded the notice without crumpling a single page, and carried it inside to the filing cabinet where every permit, inspection, report, engineering drawing, and approval letter already waited. Experience had taught me that paperwork often becomes the most important witness long before any courtroom or public meeting. Linda Whitmore clearly believed public opinion would accomplish what regulations could not. Within days, photographs of my backyard appeared across the neighborhood social media page, accompanied by cheerful captions asking whether Brookhaven Ridge should allow industrial construction to replace beautiful landscaping. Hundreds of comments followed. Some called my property a fortress. Others joked that I must expect a hurricane every weekend. One homeowner suggested I should have built a decorative fountain instead because fountains actually increased property values. Almost nobody asked why a flood engineer would spend thousands of dollars protecting a single house. It was easier to laugh than to wonder. The monthly homeowners association meeting filled the clubhouse beyond capacity. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and scented candles, while conversation stopped the moment I entered. Linda stood confidently beside a projector screen displaying enlarged photographs of my wall from multiple angles. Red circles highlighted every section of reinforced concrete as though she were presenting evidence in a criminal investigation. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes about neighborhood image, architectural consistency, and preserving community standards. Then she introduced a landscaping consultant who explained why open sight lines created a welcoming atmosphere for potential homebuyers. I listened patiently. Neither of them mentioned drainage patterns, watershed behavior, historical flood channels, or hydraulic capacity even once. When Linda finally invited me to respond, every chair turned toward me. I stood, thanked everyone for allowing me a few moments, and placed a copy of my county building permit on the front table beside the projector. Everything constructed on my property complies with county engineering codes and every required inspection, I said calmly. The design was reviewed, approved, and legally permitted before construction began. Linda glanced briefly at the permit before smiling at the audience. Legal does not always mean appropriate, she replied smoothly. Gentle laughter rolled across the room again. I gathered my paperwork without arguing because there was nothing to gain from debating people who had already chosen appearances over evidence. As I walked toward my truck, my phone vibrated with a weather notification from the National Weather Service. Forecast confidence had increased. The developing storm system over the Central Plains was slowing, gathering additional moisture, and tracking farther east than originally predicted. I looked toward the western horizon where towering clouds stood above the distant tree line like silent mountains. Everyone inside the clubhouse remained busy discussing my wall. I was already thinking about the sky. Pressure has a way of revealing who trusts facts and who only trusts comfort. By the second week after the meeting, the campaign against me had become more organized than the maintenance schedule for the entire neighborhood. Every few days another certified letter arrived, each one repeating the same demand with slightly stronger language and slightly larger fines. I filed every notice in chronological order beside my permits and inspection reports without writing a single response. The documents told two completely different stories. Mine were stamped by county engineers. Theirs were signed by committee members worried about appearances. One afternoon my phone rang while I was reviewing updated rainfall models in my home office. The caller introduced himself as an attorney representing the Homeowners Association. His voice remained polite throughout the conversation, but the message was unmistakable. Removing the wall would resolve the dispute quickly. Keeping it could lead to expensive litigation even if I eventually prevailed. I thanked him for calling, explained that every aspect of the project complied with county regulations, and wished him a pleasant afternoon. When the call ended, I added the conversation to my project log with the date, time, and a summary of everything discussed. Good engineering depends on accurate records. Good legal preparation does too. Outside my front window, the neighborhood continued treating the entire situation like harmless entertainment. Neighbors slowed their cars to glance toward my backyard. Dog walkers paused long enough to whisper before continuing down the sidewalk. Even the landscaping company that had serviced my property for nearly 2 years informed me they could no longer work at my address because they wished to avoid conflict with the Homeowners Association. I thanked them sincerely and spent the following Saturday maintaining the yard myself beneath a cloudless blue sky. While trimming shrubs along the back fence, I noticed something that most people would have ignored. Several neighboring properties had recently added decorative stone borders, raised flower beds, and extended backyard patios. Individually, the changes looked attractive. Together, they subtly interrupted the natural surface drainage that had existed since long before the subdivision was built. Water rarely notices property lines, but it always notices elevation. That evening, I attended another homeowners association meeting, not because I expected fairness, but because I preferred hearing every argument directly. Linda stood before the room with complete confidence, explaining that preserving community standards sometimes required difficult decisions. A consultant hired by the association presented computer renderings showing how my wall affected neighborhood aesthetics. Beautiful images filled the projection screen, complete with flowering shrubs and perfectly trimmed lawns. There was only one thing missing from every slide: water. No rainfall projections, no drainage analysis, no topographic information, no flood modeling. Appearance had completely replaced engineering. When the presentation ended, several residents applauded. I quietly gathered my notebook and left before anyone could invite another debate. As I stepped into the parking lot, the warm evening breeze carried an unmistakable scent of damp soil from somewhere far beyond the western horizon. My phone vibrated again with another update from the National Weather Service. The projected storm had slowed even further while drawing additional moisture. from the Gulf. Expected rainfall totals increased once again. I looked back toward the brightly lit clubhouse where neighbors continued discussing architectural harmony, then toward the darkening western sky where towering clouds slowly climbed higher with every passing hour. One conversation was built on opinions. The other was written by the atmosphere itself, and I had learned long ago that only one of them would determine what happened next. The biggest discoveries of my career had never come from dramatic moments. They came from quiet rooms, dusty records, and questions that nobody else thought were worth asking. 2 days after the last Homeowners Association meeting, I drove to the Jackson County Records Archive just after it opened. The building was almost silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rustle of aging paper being sorted behind the front desk. The clerk greeted me with a friendly smile before disappearing into the storage area and returning with several oversized survey maps, engineering binders, and planning documents dating back more than 50 years. I carefully spread the oldest map across a large viewing table, smoothing the brittle paper with both hands. The faded blue lines immediately caught my attention. Long before Brookhaven Ridge existed, a seasonal drainage corridor crossed the exact location where our subdivision now stood. It was not a large creek, but it had served as the natural path for runoff moving toward a larger watershed several miles away. As I continued reading, another document revealed the subdivision's original development plans from nearly 30 years earlier. The builders had legally redirected the drainage corridor into underground reinforced concrete pipes connected to 2 retention basins. At the time, the design satisfied every county requirement. The calculations were based on rainfall data available decades ago, and the permits were properly approved. Then I found the document that changed everything. Buried inside an engineering review was a recommendation stating that if future development increased paved surfaces or expanded residential improvements, the stormwater system should eventually be upgraded to maintain its original level of protection. I searched through every inspection report that followed. Year after year, new patios, larger driveways, decorative stone landscaping, and additional hard surfaces appeared throughout the neighborhood, yet I could not find a single record showing that the drainage infrastructure had ever been significantly expanded. The recommendation had quietly disappeared into history while the neighborhood continued growing above it. I requested copies of every relevant survey, maintenance report, and drainage study before returning home. My dining room table quickly disappeared beneath maps, elevation charts, satellite photographs, and hydraulic calculations. I overlaid historical surveys with current county geographic information system data until the patterns aligned almost perfectly. The forgotten drainage corridor still existed beneath Brookhaven Ridge. Grass, sidewalks, and backyards had hidden it from view, but the land itself had never changed. Water would always attempt to follow the same route whenever rainfall exceeded the capacity of the underground system. My flood wall had never redirected that flow toward neighboring properties. It simply protected my foundation while allowing runoff to continue along the legal drainage path determined by the surrounding elevations. The real problem was something entirely different. Over the years, many homeowners had unknowingly interrupted surface drainage by installing raised flower beds, decorative retaining borders, expanded patios, and carefully landscaped berms. Individually, those improvements looked harmless. Collectively, they created dozens of small obstacles capable of slowing or redirecting runoff during an extreme weather event. Late that evening, my computer displayed another update from the National Weather Service. Forecast confidence continued increasing while projected rainfall totals climbed even higher than the previous day. I stepped onto my back patio and looked toward the western sky, where towering clouds stretched across the horizon beneath an unusually heavy layer of humid air. The neighborhood remained peaceful, children still riding bicycles and neighbors still discussing weekend plans. Yet standing there with decades of engineering history spread across my dining room table, I realized the greatest danger facing Brookhaven Ridge had never been hidden inside my concrete wall. It had been hidden beneath the ground everyone believed they already understood. By the time the storm reached the county line, I had already stopped watching the television forecasts. They were finally catching up to what the atmosphere had been telling me for days. Instead, I trusted the instruments inside my workshop. 3 computer monitors displayed live radar, rainfall intensity, soil saturation, and water level readings from the sensors installed around my property. Every update arrived exactly on schedule, each one confirming that the storm system was strengthening rather than weakening. The predicted rainfall had climbed well beyond the assumptions used when Brookhaven Ridge was originally designed decades earlier. Outside, the air felt unusually heavy. The breeze that had carried the scent of fresh-cut grass only a week before now carried the unmistakable smell of approaching rain mixed with damp earth rising from the ground. Even the birds seemed quieter than normal, disappearing into the trees long before sunset. I followed the same routine I had rehearsed several times already. I inspected every drainage channel built into the flood wall, clearing away a handful of leaves that had collected overnight. I tested the backup generator one final time until it reached full operating speed without hesitation. The sump pump cycled exactly as programmed. Every backflow valve opened and sealed correctly under pressure. My security cameras recorded continuously, each memory card displaying more than enough available storage to capture several uninterrupted days. Finally, I walked the length of the wall, placing one hand against the cool reinforced concrete, while checking each expansion joint, anchor point, and drainage outlet. Everything remained exactly as the engineering drawings intended. Across the street, life continued almost normally. Lawn maintenance crews hurried to finish their work before the weather arrived. Children rode bicycles beneath skies that still looked bright enough to convince most people the forecast was exaggerated. Linda drove slowly through the neighborhood in her sport utility vehicle, stopping occasionally to speak with homeowners preparing patio furniture for the expected rain. As she passed my driveway, she lowered her window just enough to smile politely. "Looks like your wall might finally get to justify itself," she said with a laugh before driving away. I simply nodded. There was nothing left to explain. Engineering reaches a point where words become unnecessary because the calculations are about to speak for themselves. That evening, my phone issued the first official flood watch from the National Weather Service. Less than 2 hours later, it became a flood warning as meteorologists confirmed that multiple storm cells had merged into one slow-moving system stretching across hundreds of miles. The radar image resembled a giant curtain slowly advancing eastward without any sign of breaking apart. I printed the latest forecast, placed it beside the historical drainage maps on my workbench, and noticed how closely the predicted runoff volumes matched the conditions that had produced flooding in the archived engineering studies decades earlier. The similarities were difficult to ignore. Shortly before midnight, the first steady rain began tapping against the roof. Not a violent downpour, just a slow, consistent rhythm that filled the quiet neighborhood with the sound of countless drops landing on shingles, sidewalks, and tree leaves. I stepped onto the back patio beneath the covered porch and watched the first thin streams of water begin flowing across the yard toward the collection channels built into the wall. The system responded exactly as designed, carrying the runoff calmly toward its designated outlets. Somewhere beyond the darkness, distant thunder rolled across the horizon with slow confidence. The storm was no longer a prediction. It had arrived. And from that moment forward, every decision made over the past 30 years was about to be tested by the only force that never negotiated, never argued, and never cared what any homeowners association believed. The rain refused to hurry. That was what made it dangerous. Hour after hour it fell with steady determination, each drop adding itself to millions of others until the ground simply stopped accepting any more water. By early afternoon, every sensor in my workshop displayed exactly what I had expected. Soil saturation had reached its limit. From that moment on, nearly every additional inch of rain would travel across the surface instead of disappearing into the earth. I stood beneath the covered patio listening to the constant rhythm of water striking the flood wall before flowing smoothly into the collection channels built along its base. There was no dramatic splash, no sudden surge, only calm, controlled movement following the path established by engineering instead of chance. Inside the workshop, the monitors continued updating every few seconds. Water levels rose steadily, but remained well within the design capacity. The backup generator sat ready, although commercial power still held. The cameras recorded uninterrupted video from every corner of the property. Each piece of equipment performed exactly as it had during countless inspections and test runs. Across the rear fence, however, the neighborhood was beginning to change. Decorative flower beds that had looked perfectly harmless during dry weather now trapped shallow sheets of runoff. Raised stone borders redirected water sideways instead of downhill. Expanded backyard patios interrupted natural drainage, forcing water to collect before slowly spilling into the next available low point. None of those individual improvements seemed significant by themselves. Together, they quietly reshaped the landscape into something the original engineers had never designed. The first phone notification arrived shortly after 3 o'clock. A county emergency alert warned residents to avoid unnecessary travel because several nearby roads were beginning to flood. Minutes later, another message followed announcing temporary street closures in neighboring communities. I looked toward the front of the subdivision where water had started spreading beyond the curbs, covering sections of asphalt that usually remained perfectly dry even during ordinary storms. The storm drains still accepted water, but not nearly as quickly as runoff continued arriving. They had reached the limits of a system built for another generation's weather. My phone rang again. It was Mark from 2 houses away. His confident voice from the neighborhood meetings had disappeared. "Ethan," he said quietly, "my backyard is filling with water faster than I have ever seen. Does this stop when the rain slows down?" I answered honestly, "Not immediately. The ground is already saturated. The water still has to find its way through the drainage system." He thanked me before ending the call. Less than 10 minutes later, another neighbor called with nearly the same question. Then another. Nobody asked about property values anymore. Nobody mentioned architectural standards. The only subject left was water. As evening approached, thunder rolled steadily across the dark sky while sheets of rain blurred the houses across the street into gray silhouettes. I walked once more beside the flood wall, watching runoff enter the drainage channels exactly where the hydraulic models predicted years before. Beyond my property, shallow streams quietly reappeared across lawns that had completely hidden the old drainage corridor for decades. The land was remembering something the neighborhood had forgotten. Standing there beneath the steady rain, I realized the storm was not creating a new path at all. It was patiently uncovering the one that had always been there, waiting beneath layers of landscaping, concrete, and misplaced confidence until gravity finally reclaimed the last word. The rain finally eased just after sunrise, leaving behind a strange silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Instead of thunder, I heard generators humming in the distance, sump pumps cycling through exhausted basements, and water dripping steadily from overloaded gutters. I stepped outside carrying the same waterproof notebook I had used throughout the storm and slowly walked beside my flood wall. Every drainage outlet remained open. Every expansion joint was intact. The reinforced concrete looked almost unchanged, except for a thin layer of damp leaves collected near one corner. My sensors confirmed exactly what I had watched throughout the night. Water levels had risen within the design limits before gradually falling as the runoff moved through the channels exactly as the hydraulic calculations predicted. Beyond my property, however, Brookhaven Ridge looked very different. Several backyards remained covered with shallow standing water. Decorative retaining walls surrounded pools that had nowhere to drain. Fresh mulch floated across sidewalks while carefully shaped flower beds had become small dams trapping runoff where it had never been intended to remain. The land had quietly reclaimed the historic drainage corridor hidden beneath decades of landscaping decisions. Around mid-morning, county public works crews began arriving to inspect blocked roads and damaged drainage structures. They photographed intersections, measured standing water, and marked locations requiring additional evaluation after conditions became safe. No conclusions were reached that day. They simply documented everything carefully before leaving. 2 days later, after the remaining floodwater had drained away, county engineers returned with survey equipment and elevation maps. This time they spent hours walking the neighborhood instead of minutes. One of them eventually knocked on my front door after noticing the monitoring equipment mounted beside my flood wall. I invited the team into my workshop and showed them the rainfall logs, sensor data, inspection reports, approved permits, historical surveys from 1968, and the archived engineering recommendations describing the original drainage corridor beneath the subdivision. They examined every document without interruption. Then I transferred the security camera recordings collected throughout the storm. The videos showed runoff approaching my property, entering the collection channels, and continuing downstream exactly as designed without being redirected onto neighboring lots. Several days later, insurance adjusters also began documenting property damage throughout Brookhaven Ridge. They photographed foundations, patios, retaining walls, and saturated crawl spaces, but made no immediate determinations about responsibility. Their work depended upon engineering findings that were still being developed. Over the following weeks, county engineers compared modern survey measurements with the historical records I had uncovered before the storm. The conclusion developed gradually rather than dramatically. The legally permitted flood wall had performed exactly according to the approved design. The larger problem involved aging stormwater infrastructure combined with years of private landscaping modifications that had slowly altered how surface runoff traveled through the neighborhood. During one inspection, I noticed Linda standing several yards away watching the engineers compare elevation readings with the old county maps. She did not interrupt them. She did not organize another meeting. She simply looked from the survey markers to my flood wall and then quietly lowered her eyes. A few homeowners who had once laughed while she recorded videos of my property now stood nearby listening as engineers explained contour lines, drainage capacity, and why water had naturally returned toward the historic corridor once the overwhelmed storm system reached its limits. Nobody discussed appearances anymore. Nobody mentioned property values. Every conversation centered on measurements, documented evidence, and engineering reality. Nature had answered every argument with quiet precision, and now the records were simply catching up to what the storm had already proven. Nearly a year passed before the last construction crew packed away its equipment and the final section of upgraded drainage pipe disappeared beneath freshly restored pavement. Brookhaven Ridge looked almost the same as it had before the storm, yet anyone who understood engineering could immediately recognize the quiet differences. Larger storm drains now sat beneath the streets. Expanded drainage swales blended naturally into the landscape. Several decorative retaining walls had been redesigned to allow surface runoff to continue following its intended path instead of trapping water behind landscaped borders. The improvements were not dramatic enough to attract attention from visitors, but they represented something far more important than appearance. They represented acceptance of reality. During that same year, the Homeowners Association gradually abandoned the position it had defended so aggressively. Every violation notice issued against my flood wall was formally withdrawn after legal review confirmed that the structure had complied with county regulations from the very beginning. The fines disappeared from the records. The proposed enforcement actions quietly ended. More importantly, the association adopted a new policy requiring independent engineering review before future architectural disputes involving grading, drainage, retaining structures, or flood mitigation could ever reach a board vote. Personal opinions would never again replace documented technical evidence so easily. Linda resigned several months before the next election. She never stood in front of the neighborhood to deliver a dramatic apology, and honestly, I never expected one. Accountability does not always arrive through emotional speeches. Sometimes it arrives through silence, corrected records, and policies that prevent the same mistake from happening again. One cool Saturday morning, I was inspecting the drainage channels along my flood wall when I noticed a familiar pickup truck stopping near my driveway. Mark stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee and smiled with an expression completely different from the one he wore during those early meetings. Before saying anything else, he admitted that he had judged my project without understanding the facts. We spent the next hour walking through the neighborhood discussing contour maps, stormwater design, and everything the county engineers had explained over the previous months. It was the first conversation we had ever shared without rumors, assumptions, or arguments getting in the way. As we returned toward my driveway, a young boy riding his bicycle slowed to a stop beside the flood wall. I recognized him immediately as the same child who had quietly asked his mother during those first weeks whether I might actually be right. He looked at the reinforced concrete for a moment before smiling. "My science teacher said this wall worked exactly the way engineers planned it," he said proudly. I smiled back and answered, "That is exactly what good engineering is supposed to do." He nodded, climbed back onto his bicycle, and continued down the street. Watching him disappear around the corner, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving myself right. It was knowing that the next generation might grow up respecting preparation before disaster instead of after it. Every so often I still open the filing cabinet inside my workshop where I keep the original permits, historical surveys, rainfall records, inspection reports, sensor logs, and even printed screenshots from the video Linda once recorded while laughing at my flood wall. I have never thrown any of them away because together they tell a complete story about patience, evidence, and truth. Whenever heavy rain returns, I still place one hand against the cool concrete and listen as water quietly moves through the drainage channels exactly where the calculations predicted years before. The storm eventually ended, the arguments eventually faded, but the lesson remained exactly where it had always been. Nature never follows popularity. It only follows the path that people either respected or forgot.